Hey, Redeemer family. I love you guys. I miss you. I miss seeing you in person. And I know that you feel the same way as well. I want to start a conversation about regathering together as a church. There are some significant questions that we need to answer over time. When should we start gathering? When we do, how many people should that involve? What kinds of options can we keep available for people who aren't yet ready to gather with others at that point? What safety precautions are we going to need? Where will we even do that? We're going to need to figure out some answers to these kinds of questions. And actually, I've been talking for the past month with a small group of people from our congregation. And actually, I've been talking with pastors from throughout the Midwest and actually from across the United States as we're trying to think through these things and figure them out. And over time, every time we get a little closer to feeling like I think we see a path forward, something comes and makes it a little foggier again. I don't have all of the answers to those questions yet. One thing that I can tell you is that it's going to need to be a process and not just a one-time event. Really, there's no way that we can just flip a switch and gather everybody back at Plank Junior High again and go back to the way that things were a couple months ago. That's not going to happen anytime soon. It's going to need to be a process that we walk through over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of my answers to those questions in the next video. But in this video, I want to talk about something that I think is even more important than the specifics of how we answer those questions. Something that's even more important about when we start gathering, or where that will be, or what exactly it will look like. And what I want to talk about today is the priority of the love of Christ. I want to talk about that priority of the love of Christ kind of in our personal conduct. And then I want to talk about the priority of the love of Christ kind of in this issue of church-wide unity, okay? So first of all, at the personal level, I want to talk about this issue of the love of Christ shining through us. There's this passage in the New Testament in Titus chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, and it gives us a picture of Christian character in a complex world. Here's what Titus says, or rather, here's what Paul says to Titus. He says, remind them, and I love that he says remind them, right? If you're a Christian, you know these things, and yet sometimes we need to be reminded of them, right? Sometimes we need to be reminded what Christian character looks like in a complex world. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Now, that kind of Christian conduct would stand out in this cultural moment, wouldn't it? Let's let some of those phrases sink in a little bit. Submissive to rulers and authorities. Now, is there a place for civil disobedience? Is there a place for civil protest? Yes, there is. And yet, the New Testament calls us as followers of Christ to have a default posture of submission to rulers and authorities, even when they are making decisions that we wouldn't make ourselves, right? And that kind of posture will shine in a culture that prides itself for rugged individualism, right? Let's think about some of these others. Speaking evil of nobody. Your Facebook page will be different if your Facebook page refuses to speak evil of other people, right? It will stand out. Avoiding quarreling, gentleness. And then this phrase kind of jumps off the page, showing perfect courtesy to all people. At some point in the reopening process, at some point in the regathering process of the church, you're going to see things a little bit differently than some other people do. In our church family, we have some people with particular health vulnerabilities, or maybe their kids have particular health vulnerabilities. And because of that, for understandable reasons, they're going to be very, very, very cautious about getting together in the same building with other believers, maybe even weeks or months after other people are doing that. At the same time, I know that we've got people in our church family who, like today, if we unleash them to do it, they would drive from house to house and they'd give everybody a hug and they'd kiss everybody on the cheek just because they miss everybody so much, right? And we've got both of these kinds of people in our church family right now. We're not always going to see eye to eye on these things. And listen, humility and gentleness doesn't mean that we won't have any opinions. Humility and gentleness doesn't mean that we can't talk with other people when we see things a little bit differently than them. But this idea of love working itself out with perfect courtesy toward all people, it may change the tone of those discussions a little bit, right? It may mean that we get rid of some of the smug sarcasm. It may mean that we stop just villainizing other people because they see things differently than we do. It may mean making more charitable judgments about other people's motives instead of jumping to conclusions. Humility and gentleness and courage may mean that we listen to other people with more empathy before we just look for the next opportunity to express our own opinion, right? Perfect courtesy toward all people probably means taking their pain seriously and listening with compassion, whether the pain that they're experiencing is an economic pain or whether the pain that they're experiencing is kind of a political pain or a cultural pain, or whether the pain that they're experiencing is related to this health crisis, whatever kind of pain others are experiencing, showing perfect courtesy toward all people probably involves listening with compassion and taking other people seriously. It involves showing the heart of Christ to others. You know, Matthew 9:36 says that when Jesus saw the crowds of people, he had compassion on them because they were distressed like sheep without a shepherd. When we look around at crowds of people around us who are hurting in various ways, our hearts should similarly be filled with a kind of compassion that will show Christian character in the form of love that may involve showing perfect courtesy even toward people who see things differently than we do. That's a quick sketch of how we can walk in love and demonstrate Christian character in this time. But I also want to talk about this issue of unity together as a church family, not just at the individual level, but together as a body. Obviously, we live in a very polarized cultural moment right now. So think about a few of these things. Reopening schools, reopening economies, reopening states. These are highly political issues and they're highly divisive issues right now. And I'm quite confident that our enemy, the devil, is going to try to use the regathering of churches as an opportunity to rip apart brothers and sisters who are united in the blood of Jesus Christ. And we just as a church want to stand against Satan's goals in this thing. We want to resist that polarization. We want to resist the division that could come in this time. If we listen carefully, we can still hear the voice of Jesus speaking through the loud chaos of this cultural moment. And here's what Jesus says, John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. He says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." Do you hear a theme? Do you hear the theme that Jesus is harping on there? Do you hear it? Ray Ortlund summarizes the essence of this passage beautifully when he says that the command of Christ is that we love one another. The example of Christ is that we die for one another. And the promise of Christ is that our love will show a skeptical world the difference that Jesus really makes. Now, in order for us to get there, to demonstrating to the world what the difference that the love of Jesus makes in our lives, in order to get to that place where we are willing to lay down our own lives and sometimes lay down our own preferences, and when we get to that place where we are ready to love other people, even the ones who don't see things exactly the same way I do, it's going to require the work of Christ himself. Christ, who loved us and gave himself for us. Christ, who lives in us. as we walk in communion with him and kind of prayerful dependence on him, that's where we'll discover the power that we need to walk through this challenging season and this potentially divisive season in a way that shines the love of Christ instead of mirroring the chaos and division of the culture around us. As we walk closely with him, we'll find ourselves in a place where we can genuinely say that what unites us together in Jesus Christ really is far more important than anything that could separate us from one another. And in the end, that makes much of Jesus. And so I just want to suggest, as we get our hearts ready to talk about regathering, and as we get our hearts ready to start thinking about what that could look like, I want to suggest that we begin with our hearts full of the love of Christ, ready to demonstrate the love of Christ in our own personal Christian conduct, and ready to express the love of Christ in the unity of the church, in the unity of men and women who have been united in the blood of Jesus Christ, all to the glory of his name.